I don't know. I haven't he's not here yet, but
Okay,
he
and
knows.
Sergey?
Yeah, I don't know whether you know each other, but David Last is a professor at the RMC, the Royal Military College, and he's one of these peacenik warriors or something. Does it?
Peacekeeping training.
Yes.
He headed that up for
Yeah, yeah, he's done
a
that a
couple
long time.
decades.
He's really good at peacekeeping training. All right, looks like we may be actually live, so watch what you say. Okay. All right. So David Last may or may not show up, and I don't know about Sergei Plekhanov, who's I don't know. He hasn't replied. He may be out of town or something. So it doesn't matter. We've got a good conversational material here. So yes, Lou,
I was just saying, wanted to ask Sergey. I made a presentation at the Institute in 1985, and I wondered if he was there.
The USA Canada Institute in Moscow?
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure he would have been there at that point, but he came to North America as kind of an expatriate or something at about the time of the Cold War broke down. I know him well, but I don't know the full story there. I think there's something mysterious about the whole thing. Anyway, what do we want to talk about today? Doug and I have already launched the beginnings of a conversation about China, although that may not be on anybody else's mind. I hear there's been an earthquake in Croatia today. Does anybody know anything about that?
Not yet.
No. Nope.
No.
Okay. Who has something on your mind that you would like to share?
Well, what are you thinking about China?
I don't want to hijack the conversation with that, but it's a question that's been on my mind. The sense I get from Canadian foreign policy, from the foreign minister and a lot of other places, is that they're basically biding their time until the next US president comes into office, particularly around issues surrounding China, although of course also climate and things like that, which also involves China. And there's a sense that that Biden's approach to China will be less unilateral and more of a mixture of engagement and confrontation than the purely confrontational approach of the Trump administration. But I think the question in the air is, how do you do that? And I think Metta asked that earlier. How does a US president interact with China in a way that brings a consensus of democratic countries together around the question, avoids a second Cold War, but also wields some sticks along with the carrots to deal with the ethnic persecutions and human rights abuses and crushing of democracy in Hong Kong and whatnot. Biden's an old Cold Warrior, and either he learned the lessons of the Cold War in that simply isolating Russia, the Soviet Union didn't work, or he recognizes that that China is a different beast because you can't just decouple from it. The world is economically related to it, or he didn't learn any of that, and so on. I have no idea. So, but what's the answer? What does a U.S. approach to China look like, and is it worth the rest of us joining in on it?
Well, China is a very different beast. The Soviet system was highly productive in the military sphere, but was economically not very productive. Whereas the Chinese communism, or communo-capitalism, whatever you want to call it, has been extremely productive and is moving into what may be a dominant position, depending on how the Americans manage in the world economy. And so we're vitally involved with even the competition. I mean, for Africa, the competition between the United States and Russia was very important. But China is moving into the same role and is doing so on a larger scale.
Well,
China's now.
That's an interesting thing to compare it with the Cold War, but actually, in a way, it's easier and harder. It's easier in the sense that China doesn't have an ideology that was trying to be spread worldwide. They think they're a good model, but they're not really interested in the same way that the Soviet Union was for many years in supporting political change, bringing in Marxism. And at the same time, there was a great deal of mitigation and contact with the Soviet Union. The transition to the Soviet becoming a country in which we had a great deal of exchange of culture, and that really helped undermine the belief in the Soviet ideology. So some of that, I think, is in the mind of people when dealing with China as well. And the Chinese, after all, are very open in some regards. The exchange of students with the United States has been up until Trump and Xi maybe been quite extensive. And I think that had a very important role in the US-Soviet transformation, or the Soviet transformation.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So the historical lesson is probably that notions of containment never really worked and maybe didn't really happen. And that I've always got a sense from the history that forms of engagement played a bigger role, as Louis is saying, and that possibly the end of the Cold War could have happened a few years earlier if, in fact, there'd been a more engaged approach.
Yeah. And if they could have had a leader who was not falling ill and dying.
Indeed.
In a long period of just being stagnated, and only when Gorbachev was chosen as a young man and with ideas did the change happen. But he was chosen by the elite, not by the working class people of Russia.
I guess I think that if there were no human rights issues, either in Russia or China, I wouldn't have any problem. I mean, the economic competition shouldn't be problematic, and let them do what they please in terms of building roads in Africa or whatever they want to do, or a Silk Road across Asia. It's the human rights thing, and I don't have an answer to how you try to impose any kind of pressure on any country to really effectively get some necessarily to change their human rights policy. I don't know, Paul, who works on the question of the Rohingya and so on, and has taken care of Burmese expatriates to Canada over many years. The question of what to do about defending the Rohingya is exactly the same question as how you would take care of the Uyghurs, and if China were not being so hard on the Uyghurs and on Hong Kong and some other places. Go ahead, I'm gonna go mute. Say what you please.
Well, I think there's also a configuration of forces. Biden, as Doug said, is an old Cold Warrior. He's also, as I understand it, committed to building an alliance to restrict Chinese expansion. And in Southeast Asia,
Oops.
Now
Taiwan,
you're
the
frozen,
Philippines.
Marty.
What?
You were frozen. I wasn't hearing anything, and
Oh,
your lips weren't moving.
my internet connection is unstable.
It's okay. We got you up to you saying in Southeast Asia.
In Southeast Asia, he's dealing with countries that are threatened by China. In other areas, he's dealing with countries that that want to be friendly, like some African countries, with both sides. I don't know what his position would be in Central Asia, where the Belt and Road promises an economic opening, economic development. But certainly in Southeast Asia, there's Vietnam and Taiwan in particular are threatened by Chinese expansion. And they're a key part of the alliance which Biden supposedly wants to recreate.
That was part of the thinking behind the Trans-Pacific Partnership, of course, which Vietnam in particular was very enthusiastic about, probably because it stood to gain the most by having those type of trade connections. But the idea of building a trading bloc of liberal democracies in Asia to step around China was part of the thinking. I'm wondering if it's worth trying to get the United States back into that, or if that's a form of thinking that doesn't really make much sense in the year 2020.
Yeah, I'm sorry to be so silent about this, but that is not one of my areas that I sort of follow it, but not in any detail to make a meaningful contribution to this discussion.
Metta, you're muted.
You do have thoughts about what to do about human rights violations, and I think that those solutions or interventions are kind of universal. They should apply to a lot of situations.
Well, I'd be interested in hearing from Paul on the same question as it involves Burma, Myanmar. Of course, it's a country that it's easier to wield a stick to change its ways, but because we're not economically dependent on Burma, but that hasn't worked either, or has it? Paul, are there approaches that countries like Canada, the United States should be taking that they aren't?
I wonder if a strategy of more positive benefits from not imposing nasty human rights violations. If you're just exhorting people to be nice and decent, and will hit you if you don't be nice, maybe counterproductive rather than winning over some idea that if you want to be progressive and have well-being for your people, you're better off is allowing them to become cooperative helpmates in production, and it's hard to coerce people to be nice. There are great limitations to that, and I just think if there was a way of beginning to think about over and over again and explaining the benefits of decency. And there are mutual gains to be had. You waste energy. I mean, the Soviet Union, by being so harsh on its own people, obviously was self-destructive. That didn't work very well. And, they had more people in uniform doing unproductive work than if they relaxed a little. But I think partly in some cases, maybe in China, they're afraid that, one thing can lead to another, and they don't want to go the way the Soviet Union went, which they I think of as a bad example. But I don't know. I don't have a spelled out strategy in mind.
Can I give you a bit of background? I first went to Burma in 1988 for 7 days. I went back 4 more times over the years. I was involved extensively with Canadian Friends of Burma. I was extensively involved with, not directly with Aung San Suu Kyi, but with her husband. I met with him when he came over to get an honorary degree for her from U of T. I was involved with something called the Canadian Friends of Burma, as well as a little bit involved with the Parliamentary Friends of Burma, and involved with a lot of groups working on the border. And sort of the Canadian Friends of Burma started falling apart in 2013 when the first attacks on the Rohingya occurred in Western Burma. And what I found was that most of the Burmese in the group had no sympathy whatsoever for the Rohingya, and it just blew the organization apart. And then in 2017, when the major attacks occurred, I've really had very little to do actually with Burma. I follow what's going on there a little bit, but certainly I do a lot of stuff. I post a lot of stuff on the Rohingya. I was on the board until this month, I guess, of the Association to Develop Democratic Burma, which is run by a guy named Harn Yongwei, whose father was the first president of Burma. So I've been following the Rohingya stuff a lot, and I don't see any movement at all from the Aung San Suu Kyi or people in Burma towards any relaxation of anything. And they talk occasionally about repatriation, but I think it's all a myth as far as the Burmese government is concerned.
What would you do about it, though, Paul? I mean, I always am looking for, prescriptions, and I don't know. I mean, it seems to me it's a good thing that Gambia took this thing to the World Court, but that's going to take several years, and what good is that going to do? I mean, even Lou might say that's not a good idea because that's coercive. I don't know. It's not. It can't be very coercive, but it's a slap on the wrist at least. It is. I mean, it's a good thing they're doing it. I think that. But what more can one do? Tell them that they would benefit more if they'd be nice. I mean, I'm sorry. I really am looking for answers.
If I understand what I've heard Paul say and right before and others on this topic, the problem with what Lou's suggesting is that the regime in Burma vis-a-vis the Rohingya, and I think equally as much the regime in China vis-a-vis the Uyghurs, they think they are being nice. They think they think within their own internal logic that they are providing security for maybe somebody who's not that particular ethnic group. They think they are keeping back something that's a threat to their country, and I think within the perspective of the elites and leadership in Burma, what they hear from their internal circles is constant affirmation of this. And there's this problem that if you're a foreign government trying to put them on the right path and so on, it's very easy to code those foreign governments as being part of this invasion or part of this this threat from outside. Here's a bunch of people saying that we don't have a problem with these people. They're in fact supporting these people. and this is a nettlesome problem that's hard to deal with. It's not just Aung San Suu Kyi who has decided to launch a violent campaign of expulsion against the Rohingya. It's a consensus within the ruling class and ethnic groups in Burma, if I understand correctly, Paul. And how do you break through that?
I don't know. I mean, that's my impression, is that the Burmans are supportive of the harsh dealing with the Rohingya, that there isn't much support for actually being reasonable and being sympathetic. I don't know whether any of you know the history of the Rohingya in Burma. Britain took over Western Burma in about 1820. The British Raj took over, and they brought in what are now the Rohingya from what's now Bangladesh. And when the country achieved independence in 47, they were all given citizenship, and they had citizenship until 1982 when the military took it away from them. So it's a very long history of not very nice treatment of the Rohingya.
Paul, can I interrupt you because I have an interesting controversy here too. I don't want to call it a bone to pick with you because I don't know who's right, but you wrote a piece for the magazine, just the issue that just came out about this. I asked you to do it and it was great. And you said that Britain brought in the Rohingya from Bangladesh. And I had some other people were editing things and they took it out. They seem to have regarded this as controversial or questionable or something like that. Is there a definitive answer of who brought the Rohingya in? Was it Britain or not? And not that I care. I don't know that it makes any difference at this point, but I am a little puzzled. In fact, I put it back in just because you said so. I believe you more than the other people, but somebody took that out thinking that it was wrong. Can somebody elaborate on what the truth of the matter is further?
That's one for Paul, although my understanding is that although, yes, there have been migrations of populations across the borders, the sort of national mythology that Rohingya or people who are brought in is a bit misleading because they've been there as long as many other ethnic groups in what we now call Burma or Myanmar have been there. And people tend to pay attention to their migratory history when they ignore the migratory histories of other ethnic groups because they're Muslim.
Yeah, when I was a graduate student, I thought of going to Burma to do a dissertation because it was on the other side of the world, and that way I could go all around the world. But so I read a little bit about it back then in the early 50s. And I read about all the ethnic fighting that was going on in Burma. There were these tribes that were dismissed as not right, and there was suppression efforts and wars going on and on and on. And then every once in a while, I'd read something about Burma, and yeah, there were these ethnic conflicts. And they just seemed to be persistent without resolution. And the Rohingya is, so in my little knowledge, I kind of put that in the same order of there's a dominant ethnic group which wants to be in charge of everything. And there's ideologies that support that. Dreadful stuff happens. I'd have the breakup of Yugoslavia was out, dreadful atrocities that occurred, and everybody needs to have a better history.
But it looks to me like they're all united about hating the Rohingya. That's maybe the main thing they all agree on. And I don't know to what extent these ethnic conflicts have been overcome in the current government. I mean, Paul, maybe you can answer that better than I do. But I'm sorry, Marty, I interrupted you.
No, I wasn't speaking. You asked my question. That is anybody within Burma sympathetic to the Rohingya? I mean, clearly Aung San Suu Kyi has been is involved in an uneasy alliance with the military, and she doesn't, whatever she would do, it's politics for her not to support the Rohingya.
Yeah.
But how about these other ethnic minorities? Do they support each other? Do they? I assume they want a federal state. And again, Rakhine is not solidly. They're indigenous people in Rakhine. It's not. Are the Karen areas solidly Karen?
The political side of it from the top in Burma, and I have to defer to Paul on this because I don't know Burma well at all, but I have spent time in Sri Lanka and Thailand, where you've seen a resurgence of sort of Buddhist chauvinist politics. Some people would say is sort of a set of ideas that have spread all around the sort of Buddhist triangle countries of Burma, Sri Lanka, Thailand. And it does tend to view those ethnic minorities in those countries who are Muslim as being invaders, which is something you also see in China. You know, the notion that the Uyghurs are not just one of China's many ethnic groups, but are somehow invaders who've arrived late on the scene. And you see that in India too, frankly, right? I mean, a lot of the Hindutva politics is based on the idea that Urdu speakers are invaders who came late to the game. And it's a little bit like how Jews were viewed in early 20th century Europe as invaders, partly because people had witnessed a lot of refugees coming in from Ashkenazi populations driven out by pogroms, but mainly because it was an idea that once it caught hold, it was easy to say, even if it's an ethnic or religious group that's been there as long as anyone else. So I do wonder if this is a wider problem across countries that have Buddhist nationalist leadership.
Well, when I've been in Burma and also when I've been in Canada, I've been in contact and met with leaders of the Karen community and leaders of the Kachin community. So the Karen are on the Thai-Burma border and the Kachin are up on the northern border with China. And both of those groups are mainly Christian.
Does that mean they're hostile to Islam?
I don't really know. It wasn't an issue when I was meeting with them.
And Paul, do you feel that groups like the Karen get a more sympathetic treatment from the Burmese regime than the Rohingya do, perhaps for religious reasons?
I don't know about religious reasons. There's certainly been fighting with the Karen and the Burmese government. It's fairly mild right now, but I was in Manarpla, which was the headquarters, and met with some of the leaders. Actually, one of the things was we were staying at a place and there was a big TV reception thing, and I watched I think a football game in the leaders house of the Karen. That was part of my time when I was in the Karen area. Also, as I said, I met with some of the leadership.
Well, they've got all these ceasefires, but what does that really amount to? Are these conflicts really over? And I don't know whether all of them have even signed reached a ceasefire agreement. But my impression is that most of the tribal, or I don't know what language I want to use for this, but ethnic conflicts other than the Rohingya have been sort of resolved, and the government would be functioning if it weren't so screwed up about the Rohingya. Is that a fair way of looking at it?
No.
No? Okay.
Well, what they've been trying to negotiate in Burma is something called Palong 2. Aung San, when he first was in power, negotiated a Palong 1, which contemplated the ethnic minorities staying in Burma for 10 years, and then they could decide whether to get out. And they've been trying to negotiate Palong 2. And I've been up until this month, actually, I was on the board of the Associates to Develop Democratic Burma, led by a guy named Harn Yongwei. And excuse me if I'm repeating myself, but they've been trying to negotiate Palong 2. Aung San Suu Kyi has basically eliminated Harn Yongwei from participating in getting into Burma, although the organization's still working there. But there doesn't seem to be getting very far on a Palong 2 agreement.
And she's excluding him because he's basically a good guy.
That would be my impression.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's a cheery note.
Yeah, there's such a history everywhere in the world with ethnic conflict. I was just thinking that after the horrors of World War II, a lot of countries learned a lesson the hard way that such madness is self-destructive. And there was, I wonder if the vision of Europe, of an economic community, really helped mitigate some of that. For a while, and a long time even, the immediate response in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania was the Russians who had become settled there couldn't really be citizens because they weren't ethnically Estonian and Latvian. And the European Economic Community said, no, you can't do that. You shouldn't do that, and you can't do that. And they did make sure that it was possible that, yeah, those Russians could be Lithuanian, and the citizenship could not be denied because they didn't speak that language at home. But there have been that kind of attempts of a larger settled area in a way. For Spain, dealing with minority was eased by being part of Europe. The whole idea of what your identity was got layered in Europe, and it doesn't end all troubles, but it is perhaps one path.
In Eastern Europe, the issue goes back to the breakup of the great empires, both the Russian and the Habsburg Empire. That in the 1920s, the question came up with both Jews and Gypsies. And I don't know the detail. Some of you may know better than I, the Hungarian-Romanian issue in Transylvania. But the question came up of nationality. In Africa, though there have been lots of wars, most countries, the fact is that you can't open the Pandora's box, that you commit suicide. And in fact, the wars have been disastrous, no matter, except the wars of liberation, and even those have had problems. that where you have a multi-ethnic community, you've, I mean, I tend to feel that people are better off in a multi-ethnic community, but only if there are rules of the game where you accept other people's religions. And the tragedy of Yugoslavia is that it was working well, and that most Yugoslavs supported it. And when it broke down, the appeals to ethnic nationalism produced horrible, horrible results that came out of nowhere.
The current equivalent to the Yugoslavia situation, except it's not a matter of breaking up a country, but reviving conflicts between countries, is the thing that started with the Nagorno-Karabakh situation. I did an interview last week with Irakli Kabadze in Georgia, who runs now a Gandhian kind of foundation. And I'll be doing something with tomorrow that'll be relevant to that too. But he scared the daylights out of me. He said that, as you know, the Russians are now back in control of Nagorno-Karabakh, or rather the territories around it, the sort of buffered zones, and they've got the deal with Turkey and Azerbaijan, and they're trying to make a relationship with about 4 or 5 other countries in the region. And he says the Armenians are convinced that there's going to be a renewal of genocide, that the Armenians are going to be killed and are being right now being, there are human rights violations and atrocities going on. So I've got to try to figure out who in Canada knows a darn thing about what's going on in that region. I don't know of any organizations or groups of expatriate, ethnic groups working on it, but clearly the Armenian situation doesn't look very bright now, and we're not hearing about it.
The problem in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is really the great flaw of nationalism. That it is almost impossible to create national borders. And it's almost impossible because people move across borders. People move in ethnic niches. People move. I mean, Israel has the problem that it's very prosperous, so people want to live in Israel. They don't want to go away. And the Israelis are committed to it being a Jewish state. And the Estonians want Estonia to be an Estonian state. And that's impossible because there are always minorities, and there are always borders, and there are always people each in Germany, the German-Italian border. There's no way you can structure that border where there won't be Germans in Italy and Italians in Austria.
Right. Well, of course, yeah, of course, and that is the answer, but it is no practical answer. In any immediate situation where you have a real threat, that, in fact, that there are murders going on even now, then what you do, you can't just get in a pulpit and start inveighing against nationalism. You got to do something much more, muscular. And I really, do any of you have a clue what's going on there now? Because he really scared me. And he, I don't know whether he's an alarmist, maybe he is, but it's enough to make me think, we've got to figure out what is going on. I know a little bit more tomorrow because I'm going to interview with Jill Carr-Harris.
Please do, because I think Russia's role Turkey's being unambiguous in backing the Azeris, which it doesn't really need to do. There's no economic interest in this, there's and the geostrategic interest is a little hard to sort out because you're going to you're in danger of pissing off Iran and getting them into the game too, just to make a further mess of things. And while the Russians have nominally supported the Armenians in this because Russia has a big military base in Armenia. It's traditionally sided with Armenia in these things, and until recently it kind of stayed out of this one. what you're hearing, Metta, and what I'm hearing is that Russia is now doing things, but it's a little unclear what it is doing. And yes, there have been atrocities in Nagorno-Karabakh, and the impartial people have documented them. I don't think it quite amounts to a second Armenian genocide or something like that. But it's enough to be very disturbing. It's the sort of targeting of civilians that, as you said, resembles the Yugoslav wars a bit. And it certainly sounds like the ceasefire isn't much of a ceasefire.
Yeah.
I wanted to pick up Metta's mention of looking in Canada, who knows something about this. And in preparing for this conversation, I realized that I've had some connection with Canada as a neighboring country and people, and I was very thrilled when it had the International Institute, the Institute for International Peace and Security, and the peacekeeping training. Canada was a leader, and then it passed, and nothing quite has recovered of that spirit of a Canada being involved. Canada is a relatively good example of a heterogeneous country, and that's and trying to do good with it. And I wondered, is there any chance of a recovery of Canadian leadership that it really had for a while? I know it does do work in international development, and it has some good reputation for that. And I know that the University in Manitoba, in Winnipeg, has conflict resolution, peace studies program with the PhDs in both colleges. So I just was going to be, I wanted to raise that question, and maybe
I think, Lou, I think that Canadians, and I say this as an American who's been in, I've spent more of my life now in Canada than I did in the US. So I'm a Canadian and American, but more Canadian now. And I would say Canadians are among the most parochial people in the world. There is no sense of wanting to be the empire in charge of things. There's something like, we go as far as our borders, and we don't aspire to leadership in the world, even though we aspire to being good cidizens in the world. I tried to be provocative, and I'm sure Doug is going to swat me down.
No, I actually agree with you to an extent. And I think when you listen to what other countries with conflicts want to learn from Canada, it's not so much the multiculturalism thing. It should be probably, and successfully being a polyglot pluralist country and all that stuff. But it's how we manage Quebec nationalism. And the funniest example of that was maybe a dozen years ago, maybe a little longer. I was in northern Sri Lanka, in the area controlled by the LTTE, by the Tamil Tigers, which they sort of turned into a pseudo state, a little like North Korea or something. And there was hardly any signs or anything. There was no businesses or anything. It was just a militarized area. But we drove past a giant billboard with faces of various leaders on it, and a whole lot of writing in Tamil that I didn't understand, but one English phrase written in boldface, which was asymmetrical federalism. which is a phrase I had not thought anyone outside of Canada used. And I asked one of our translators, I said, what's that billboard about? And he said, oh, it's to celebrate. There was a peace mission that came in. And it was led by some guy named Bob Ray. And it went over very well.
I love that. Yeah, how's he going to do as at the UN, you think?
Bob Ray is now Canada's UN ambassador, yeah.
Yeah, right.
Well, you know, Canada does play a role in largely in part because we've never had colonies except internal colonies, and my wife attended one of the ILO's annual sessions. It was part of the Canadian delegation, and Canada played a role in negotiating an agreement which Canada was not likely to support, because they negotiate these agreements, and if they bind the government in ways the government doesn't like, the government may play a role in negotiating them, but then they're dead letter. And yet the head of the Canadian delegation was very good because she could talk to the Americans, she could talk to the Russians, and she could talk to the whole complex of third world countries. And she was an old hand. I don't remember her name anymore, but she was an old hand and very good at this game, which gives Canada an influence sort of behind the scenes, and it didn't get Canada its Security Council seat. Mm-hmm. But we're in there. We're one of those countries that plays a role because we can talk to everybody. Mm-hmm. I don't know if Doug sees it that way. Yeah.
You could describe that as sort of an ideal type of Canada, right? I think maybe observed more in the breach lately, but the role of Canada as a neutral arbiter has been historically useful. There are a number of people now who say that that just doesn't work anymore, that there's no place for a neutral arbiter country. In the Israel-Palestine conflict, there's no middle ground. There's no place for a country like Canada to stick itself in. But I don't know.
I think there's always a need for some intermediaries. Doesn't have to be the big formal one, but there are channels of non-governmental organizations and individuals, and I don't know, somehow this discussion brought up in my mind a film. I've been watching a lot of films on Netflix, and one the other night was Indian Horse. And I don't know how, I don't see any change in expression from anybody's face. It's a very moving Canadian film, I thought, about the horrors of forced assimilation, of bringing kids in and trying to end their heritage. And one kid becomes a hockey player, and it's his story.
Well, this is certainly
everybody's face is blank.
Yeah.
It didn't make any attention in Canada.
I don't know about the film, but I know that the whole issue of Indigenous rights and the need to honor their heritage and so on it's I don't really want to use this word, but don't tell anybody that I said this. I think it's a fad. I mean, it's the kind of thing that suddenly over the last couple of 2-3 years become a very important element of Canadian discourse. I mean, you can't go to any, progressive meeting of any kind without having Indigenous rights brought up as a very important issue. And it's not that I'm opposed to it as an issue. I think it's great that we think about it, but I don't really understand why it's happening now, in particular now, rather than 10 years ago or 50 years ago.
Well, I think Trudeau opened Pandora's box, and it's hard to retreat. He awakened desires in the Aboriginal community that he wasn't ready to fulfill, and so he's ended up getting his fingers burned. But I think he's pushed the issue into center stage, and I think there's an articulate Native leadership that's not going to let him back down, and it's going to keep the issue center stage. I don't think it's a fad. I think it's the Aborigines don't have votes in Parliament. They're only about 3% of the population, but they have issues in which they can mobilize sympathy.
There's demographics behind it too. It's the fastest growing. First Nations and Inuit populations are the fastest growing populations in Canada by quite a wide margin. And it's being experienced, and they're largely an urban population. And it's being experienced, I think, by them as a return from the decimation. Decimation's the wrong word. What do you call when something's cut to 1/10 its former size? that having happened to its population in Canada's first century and a half, is now recovering. And so I think you do have a new generation and sort of a political awakening that I suspect would have happened independent of whatever national political developments had happened. It's a question of whether they're done through negotiation and sensible politics, or whether they're done through confrontation, I think. And I think it'll be a while. I mean, I think some of the seeds were planted in the 1970s when you had a first political awakening, and you also had the Canadian Supreme Court's recognition that the treaties reached between Britain, especially, and also France, and the tribes of Canada are part of the Constitution. That they are constitutional documents of Canada, and therefore implicitly there's a shared sovereignty between the First Peoples of Canada and the descendants of the settlers. And I think that the constitutional implications of those decisions have yet to fully play out, and they're combining with that demographic surge in an interesting way.
Is there anything equivalent in other countries? I mean, I don't see it in the US on the same scale, but when I speak of the popularity of the issue.
Well, you go to New Zealand if you want to see sort of this a generation later. New Zealand's gone much further, and it's easier because it's a smaller country and because the two populations are intermeshed more. But New Zealand's gone much further in incorporating the politics and culture and language of its indigenous peoples into the very fabric of the country itself, including its flag and things like that. And from what I understand, and I've not been to New Zealand, in more than just symbolic ways, in actual functional ways in the structure of government.
But even the symbolic ways are important. When we think of New Zealand, if you're a sports fan, what you think of New Zealand is the haka dance. And that's a symbol of the national football team.
Rugby team.
Well, rugby. Well, rugby's the national sport, and
Yeah.
It's not. I don't know what you call it. Rugby. I think of rugby as football.
I used to play rugby. I was a scrum half at Waterloo.
You would have had a hard time with those New Zealand, with those what's they call them, the black.
Well, in the United States, Metta, we don't, at Syracuse University, every meeting is introduced by reminding people that we are on Haudenosaunee land.
Even in the States, I didn't know title acknowledgements were.
No, either.
Because
No.
we're very conscious here where there is a reservation bordering the city, and they're very traditional. They're very much in everybody's awareness. And Biden has appointed as the Secretary of the Interior for the first time a Native Indigenous person.
I'm amazed that in the long period of American history, she's the first Native person
Yes.
appointed to a federal cabinet office. That's
Finally.
really
Unbelievable, isn't it? Yeah.
I mean,
It shouldn't
in
have been,
Oklahoma,
but-
in Oklahoma, you've had state Supreme Court justices. You've had you've had one vice president who was 1/8 Aboriginal, and who spent part of his childhood on a reservation. But he was, you know, he looked lily white.
Now I
I'm
should say
16th Choctaw, by the way. So, and from
every time I meet with you, I learn something else about you that's surprising. I should say Canada's hardly virtuous in this area too. I think our first Indigenous cabinet ministers are pretty recent, and of course, Native Canadians, First Nations people didn't even have the vote until I think 1960 or 1961.
Yeah, that horrifies me.
Mm-hmm. We're at an hour now and a bit, and I'm afraid I have to move on to another obligation, which is too bad because this is a great group of people, and I'd like to hear each of you for about an hour each. So, Metta, your responsibility is to make sure that happens.
no,
Well, at least
more than I'm doing.
At least, Doug, we get to read you almost every Saturday.
Like it or not, yeah.
Well, I like it, but I've enjoyed everything you've written, including 2 of your books.
Thank you. Well, you've given me some good fodder, so I hope you don't mind me hijacking these things to get. I have no more clarity on how to approach China than I did when I came in, and for that matter, on how to solve Burma's problems. But
We did cover the waterfront today. I must say, I've never been in such a wandering conversation. Went all over the globe. Thank you all. This has been fun.
Thank you for putting us together.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll
Metta.
put some of it on our website and on our YouTube channel, which I haven't explained to you, but I'll tell you about it later. Okay?
and when's the next one, Metta?
Yeah?
When's the next one?
Well, look, I mean, this is live right now, but I'm going to take snips from this. I usually take clips, put them together, and then, make a composite kind of recap. And then it might go up next Monday, but it might not be till the following Monday. It's every Monday night so far. Although I think I'm going to start doing it twice a week, putting it up, because I don't want to get into this, but it's really getting to be much more of a project than I had envisioned. And I can't do all the work, but at any rate, there are many fun things coming up that I can see that will be happening. And I'll tell you about it later. Okie doke. Thank you guys. See ya.
Take care.
Okay,